Dry January was officially started in 2013 by an organization called Alcohol Change UK. And since then, it's spread all around the world, including becoming quite popular right here in Canada. But the idea is really pretty straightforward that you quit drinking alcohol for the entire month of January. Unfortunately, it turns out to be one of those things that are probably easier said than done for a lot of people, especially in the wintertime. We know that people in colder climates tend to drink more, and we do even more so at darker times of year. This is reflected in Canada's rates of alcohol intake. According to the Canadian Alcohol and Drugs Survey, about three-quarters of Canadians report consuming alcohol each year. Now, of those nearly 24 million people who are drinking, about 20% of them, or 4.8 million people, experienced at least one alcohol related harm in the past year. So I think this is probably part of the reason why the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction updated Canada's guidance on alcohol and health just last year. They dramatically reduced the safe limit, and they recommended that no matter how much you drink, less is better. Now, the evidence here shows that for people who do participate in dry January, the benefits can actually extend well beyond the month itself, and that's through sustained changes to their drinking habits. Now, whether you started on the 1st of January or just now, let's talk a little bit about the first steps. Most people who stop drinking for dry January, they simply stop cold. Now, if you do this, depending on how much you drink and how often, most people will experience varying degrees of withdrawal for a short period of time. But don't let that scare you off. These are normal, expected adjustment reactions. And for most people, they can actually be relatively mild. So we're talking about things like fatigue, irritability, nausea, maybe some anxiety, muscle aches, and increased heart rate. Sometimes you might not actually even realize what you're feeling is withdrawal, especially if you've ever heard yourself say something like, well, I don't really drink that much, right? I think we tend to underestimate our own consumption, at least in part because of the stigma around alcoholism. There's also a cognitive bias out there called the ostrich effect, which is about how people often avoid negative information, including feedback that could help them. So, deciding to make a change, that's really the first step here, whether you think you have a drinking problem or not. Then the next steps are going to be to notice and plan contingencies for some of your triggers. Now, triggers, they can be external, out there in space and time. Maybe, for example, whenever you're in your living room watching TV or sports, or maybe when you get home at the end of the workday. But triggers can also be internal, inside your experience of the world. So, for example, maybe you drink whenever you're feeling stressed or angry or lonely. Maybe you don't want to feel that way because the feeling is the trigger. So, get to know yourself here and then be prepared and proactive. Come up with some substitute behaviors instead for when you're inevitably going to encounter some of these triggers, especially if they're predictable. You know, it's going to be 5 o'clock every day. You're going to feel stressed sometimes. Some healthy substitutions that you can have at the ready: water or non alcoholic alternatives instead when you get the urge. Or if it's a predictable time that comes up, a time trigger, schedule time at the gym instead, or go for a walk or a run to engage your body. Mental distractions can be helpful here too: a hobby, a project, maybe preparing a complex recipe for dinner, something that you can really lose yourself in for a little while. Just be mindful here not to substitute one unhealthy escape behavior for another. I think it's fairly well known that sometimes when people stop drinking, they eat more instead, or they smoke more, or consume more cannabis or edibles. It's really pretty amazing that when you quit, you can bet that your mind is going to start to whisper to you, and then maybe even at some point scream at you, all sorts of justifications and excuses for why you should keep drinking. You know, this is silly. I don't have to do this. It's harmless. What's one more drink? Just sit back and watch all the mental fireworks that your mind is capable of when you're under pressure. But you know what? You actually don't have to do anything at all about that. It's okay to gently resist and to sit with the discomfort instead. It will eventually pass, and you will feel better on the other side of it. On the other side, there's actually quite a lot of mental health benefits to sticking to it. Your mind is going to start to clear within days. You'll be better able to concentrate and to think through complex problems. Your quality of sleep is going to improve fairly quickly. And that's because it'll reduce your risk for sleep apnea and restlessness. It should reduce your snoring as well. And we know that good sleep is critical to your mental health. You should start to experience improvements to your gut health fairly quickly as well. And that's actually really important for your mental health because the gut is known as the second brain. The enteric nervous system in the gut actually provides about 95% of your total body serotonin. That's the neurotransmitter that's involved with mood, one of them. Now, our mood is reciprocally linked back to why a lot of people drink to begin with. So it can actually be a bit of a vicious or virtuous cycle, depending on how you look at it and how you use it. Alcohol is a psychotropic depressant of the central nervous system. Sometimes I think we're drawn to use it to depress or escape from some uncomfortable feelings, especially activating feelings like stress, anxiety, and unresolved trauma. Unfortunately, it backfires. It might temporarily alleviate some of the more salient symptoms, but the effect goes away pretty quickly, and you end up lower than you were before. So that's why alcohol has an impact on people with depression in particular. It increases the intensity and the duration of depression, and ultimately, it interferes with your recovery. Now, since I mentioned a mental illness here, I think it is important to note that dry January was never intended as a treatment for an alcohol use disorder, and it doesn't take the place of either medical or peer support. But even there, though, I do think that it can be a good motivator, a sort of symbolic starting line to consider change, whether you experience problematic drinking or not. Now, we're partway through January at the time that I'm recording this, or maybe you're watching it and January is already over. Is it too late? Not at all. If you didn't start on January 1st, that's okay. Start today, whatever day it is. Maybe you tried it, but you've already given up. Restart today, even if it's not even January anymore. Maybe you need another one of those symbolic starting lines. There's another one coming up in February. The Canadian Cancer Society has a dry February campaign too. And that's because we know that any type or amount of alcohol increases your risk for a whole host of cancers, cancers of the head and neck, the breast, stomach, pancreas, colon, liver. Really, even if we're beyond February by the time you see this, any time of year is the right time to reduce your alcohol intake and to improve your health, mentally and physically. So I'd say start wherever and whenever you are and go from there. Now, every time I do one of these columns, if you've watched the other ones before, you know I always like to share something that I'm grateful for in the context of the conversation that we're having right now. This time, I'm grateful for knowing when it's time to quit. Having perseverance and fortitude to stick with something, that's a great attribute to have when it's properly focused. But I think that the other half of resilience is really knowing what and when to move on from something that no longer serves you. There's a few lines from a poem on quitting by Edgar Albert Guest that I think speaks well to this, so I'll leave you with this. For the toughest kind of game you'll find is to make your body obey your mind, and you never will know what is meant by grit unless there's something you've tried to quit.